his talk. So Brian, thank you very much for joining us. Brian is the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of the State Economy, a non-profit organization based in Virginia. Czech served in the headquarters of the US Fish and Wildlife Service from 1999 to 2017, including being visiting professor in Virginia's Tech National Capital Region during that period. He's the author of 3 books, and most recently, he authored Supply Shock, Economic Growth at the Crossroads, and The Steady State Solution. Brian has a bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin, a master's of science from the University of Washington, and a PhD from the University of Arizona. Thank you very much for being with us, Brian, and I'll leave it all over to you.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you, and it's really a privilege to address you and your audience today. I really appreciate the work that you do at Scientists Warning Europe and Scientists Warning in general. And I want to show you one of the reasons I appreciate that so much. And I'll need to share the screen and go to the slides. And there we are. I assume you can see the slides now. And
that's fine. It's perfect.
Good. And so this is actually the homepage of Scientists Warning Europe. I clipped it on there. There's a tiny modification, but I like the approach. I like the tenor because I feel that we, and when I say we, I mean environmental scientists, sustainability communications people, and those concerned about posterity. I'm afraid that we've fallen into this, what we might call the image protection syndrome, where a lot of us have become really obsessed with a so-called positive approach, and we've adopted kind of an unbalanced emphasis on so-called solutions. Sometimes they're often pretty questionable. And so what we're doing is we're leaving the heavy lifting of the dire heralding to others. And it's as if we're afraid of, in the mirror, looking like Cassandra, like a Cassandra that's constantly warning about, dire scenarios right down the road. And as an overreaction to that fear, we end up looking like Pollyanna instead. And so, drinking the green Kool-Aid kind of thing. And so that's why I like the approach of Scientists Warning. They don't do that. And in fact, here's a solution. You might say from outside the box, at least from outside that image protection syndrome box. We should be emphasizing the problems and sounding the alarm. And so you do that at Scientists Warning, and we do a little bit of that at CASI too. We try to take a balanced approach with warnings and solutions. But this is a clip of our homepage. And now I want to go back to the screen sharing, if I can figure out how to do that, and select another site and show you what we were trying for a while. Let's see. New share. Okay, I'm sorry. Here we go. And when we go to the to that site, here it is online. Sorry about the delay there. You'll see that we have on top here this rolling GDP meter, which is showing that as GDP is bloating, it's a threat to environmental protection and jobs, economic sustainability, and national security and international stability. Now I want to show you a little video clip, I guess we'd call it, that used to be our homepage, and see what you think of this. Yes, so it ends up with the offer to folks to sign the position, which is done here. And this leads you to the position that you can sign that helps to warn people, the public and policymakers, that there are limits to growth. There is a limit to economic growth, and growth is starting to cause more problems than it solves. So thank you for your patience in me getting to that spot. Now I'm going to stop that share and go back to the slides. And we'll start back in that spot and move on with the with some of the ecological macroeconomics of the talk. So we know that economic growth isn't sustainable. At some point it hits this carrying capacity, as we'd call it in ecology. And of course, perpetual degrowth wouldn't be sustainable either. And so the sustainable alternative then is what we call the steady state economy. And it cannot be a flatlined economy. It'd be fluctuating, hopefully mildly fluctuating without shocks, and ideally fluctuating around some optimum level. And I think it always helps to remind ourselves exactly what economic growth is when we start talking about growth and limits to growth. Economic growth is simply an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And so it's typically expressed in terms of GDP, or gross domestic product, and it entails the increasing population and or per capita production and consumption. So steady state economy is all of that except stabilized instead of growing. And now, so we're starting with that, and then, that also explains our logo at Cassie. You see the sigmoid growth curve of the economy flattening out with, by the way, what E.O. Wilson would communicate as half Earth, trying to save half Earth, which of course it's far too late for that already, for biodiversity. But it's not viewed this way in conventional economic growth theory. You know, conventional economics, especially growth theory, is centered around this production function that tells us that production is a function of capital and labor. They leave out land entirely. There's a long story behind this, political and technical. But as a result of that, what we might call the landless production function, we have in basic econ textbooks as well as business curricula, this vision of the economy as a circular flow of money between businesses and households. And that's for the labor and the products, conversely. And if your vision of the economy is like that, well, how would you think about the process of economic growth? You just kind of think about it like this. It's a perpetually growing circular flow of money. And of course, in ecological macroeconomics, we start actually with the context, evolutionarily and physically and biologically. And so we know that first there was planet Earth, and yes, sun providing energy to Earth and allowing for the growth of the ecosystems on planet Earth. And then humans evolved and were created, and then the economy starts. And yes, you do have a circular flow of money, but it does always require land and the natural resources thereon, and the natural capital, the woods, the waters, the soils, the minerals, fisheries, and so on. And because of the second two laws, because of the laws of thermodynamics, the second law in particular, there are pollutants in the form of waste material and heat as well, waste heat. So that's why we have limits to growth. So we know that there's some limit to the growth of this economy. So now we have another question to address, and this one is where the controversy starts. Does that mean then that there's a limit to GDP? Now we already have a hint at this because we defined economic growth clearly. That's one of the reasons we did that. And we said how it's indicated by GDP, and it's actually more than just indicated. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we're going to address this question and also recognize that GDP is put in monetary terms. So then that brings up another interesting question. Can we express limits to growth in terms of money? And that's what I want to talk about next. So, we know that money is a means of exchange. It's a unit of account. It's a store of value. But and what we don't often pay attention to is that in the economy, money exists as a stock and a flow. That's the money supply, and the main flow, the flow that we're most concerned with, is GDP. And let me explain why we view that as a flow. GDP is the monetary value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's borders. That's the standard application of GDP. And this is what's called the fundamental identity of national income accounting. Production equals income equals expenditure. These are the three approaches for calculating GDP. And these are clear, and these two, by the way, do reflect the circular flow of money, and these clearly are flows. Expenditure of one is income of another. But again, now it's not the expenditure on anything, it's the production of final goods and services, the income from final goods and services, the expenditure on final goods and services. It's the loaves of bread, not the wheat and the salt that went into the baking of those loaves. And here's a way to drive that point home. It's not every transaction out there. This doesn't contribute to GDP. The wages of the casino staff do, but not pulling that handle. And similarly, all the transactions for purposes of investing in derivatives on the trading floor, that doesn't go into GDP. So right away, we can see that GDP reflects the real economy. Now, I want to talk just briefly about the origins of money, because like Aristotle said, he who thus considers things in their first growth and origin will obtain the clearest view of them. So what about money? Well, we know that the origins of money were in these three places, especially Mesopotamia, Lydia in ancient Greece, and China, where shekels and coins of electrum, which is a natural alloy of silver and gold, and copper coins, respectively, came into being from 5,000 to about 2,200 years ago. And we also know that in these regions, as with other regions where money later evolved, there were typically forms of what we might call proto-money, and you can see some of the most famously barley grains in Mesopotamia, where in Sumerian, barley is called shet, and so that's the origin of the shekel. It started out as 160 grains of barley. But anyway, throughout those regions where money evolved, there were natural resource forms, often agricultural and extractive, as proto-money. And let's dig back a little bit further yet then, thinking about the origins of money, and we find that it's no coincidence then that these same regions are also famous anthropologically, archaeologically, and evolutionarily as originating another thing, and that's agriculture. And so that leads us then to what we call at Cassie the trophic theory of money. money originates via the agricultural surplus that frees the hands for the division of labor unto the manufacturing and service sectors. Trophic theory of money. Why do we call it the trophic theory? Well, we're using principles of ecology, and we recognize that in the economy of nature, we have these three main trophic levels. It starts with the producers at the base. These are the plants that literally produce food in the process of photosynthesis. When you have enough of that, enough surplus production, then you can have populations of primary consumers, those species that eat directly the producers, the plants. And when there's enough of that, then you can have secondary consumers, which eat the primary consumers. And of course, you can have intermediate levels. You can have omnivores that eat some primary consumers and plants. And throughout this economy of nature, you also have some species that aren't so readily recognized as occupying trophic levels, service providers like scavengers, for example, and decomposers. But most of the service provision in the economy of nature is provided by and among these trophic levels as well. Primary consumers also in many cases function as pollinators, for example, in their life history. With the human economy, it has to follow the same basic rules, and we sure have a trophic structure as well there that starts with the producers at the base. And this has been known and discussed in one way or another no later than with Francois Quesnay and the physiocrats in 1750s to 1780s France, especially with Quesnay's Tableau Economique. But we need to get back to a focus on that with ecological macroeconomics and recognize that you don't have any heavy manufacturing unless you have surplus at the base of agro-extractive activity. And you certainly don't have any light manufacturing without having the heavier manufacturing. And due to the technological proliferation of Homo sapiens, we do have service sectors that are very identifiable and distinguished in that sense of providing services, but they too are constantly interacting as an integral element of this basic trophic structure. So the primary corollary of the trophic theory of money is that the quantity of money and GDP as that flow of money indicates the amount of agricultural surplus and related activity at the trophic base, and therefore the environmental impact of the economy. It's one of the main points of the talk. GDP indicates the environmental impact of the economy. Remember, here was our definition, and we didn't spend much time emphasizing this phrase in the aggregate, but it's really a key phrase because economic growth, it's not just more organic vegetables here and less Roundup Ready soybeans there. It's a growth of that trophically structured macroeconomy. It's a growth of the integrated whole. It's a macroeconomic process. So there it is. That's a little more relevant view in the 21st century of economic growth. It's not a circular flow of money going out into nothingness. It's this trophic structure expanding at the base, expanding, and we'll see what that means in real life now. And yeah, we have some time to talk a little bit about these. We have extremely industrial agriculture at this point with that $76 trillion global economy that the rolling GDP meter indicated before. We're up to things like this really heavy industrial kind of agriculture, which biologically is extremely vulnerable because this is such a simplistic ecosystem and that requires tremendous amounts of inputs in terms of energy and fertilizers and chemicals. Here's how that plays out in terms of water needs. This is what you see if you look down from flying over the state of Kansas, and that's what it is on the ground. It's this pivot agriculture, it's pivot irrigation that's extracting water from the Oglala Aquifer, which we know is going to be running dry. At the edges, it already is. In marginal portions, it is. And here's what that pivot agriculture looks like from the air in Saudi Arabia. There's what it looks like on the ground in that region. But anywhere where there's aquifer drying, drought as a result of climate change, or just overuse of water for other purposes, this is what starts to happen to soils and crops. And in fact, when we look around the world, it doesn't have to be in places where we have to be draining those fossil aquifers. It's places where water would seem to be plentiful at first glance, and always was considered plentiful in the 20th century. But now we're finding that there's water stress even where there's plenty of water, where there had been supposedly plenty of water, if there are any soils in that area to practice agriculture. And, you know, moving out from the basic crop production, we have the domestic livestock production as well, causing such overgrazing problems in the American West, for example, and many other regions in the world. And accounting, by the way, in the case of domestic livestock production for beef and dairy, using about, I want to say it's 55% of the water that's consumed in California. And of course, these are heavily polluting industries, these livestock production sectors, and very disease prone as well. And then moving out a little bit further from the food production itself, we have the other extractive sectors such as logging. And as that economy grows, the more intensive these extractive activities have to get. And so you get this clear-cut type of logging, you get this open pit type of mining, and so on. And it's only when there's plenty of that kind of activity that you can have plenty of heavy manufacturing. These kinds of operations, which are very energy intensive and very fossil fuel combusting. And when we think about heavy manufacturing, I suppose that's the time also to think about the infrastructure. This is some heavy manufacturing for purposes of moving the labor and the product and transmitting the energy and the water to conduct all these economic activities. When there's plenty of that, then you can have plenty of light manufacturing as well. And certainly not going to go through very many examples at all, but everybody knows what light manufacturing is: production of little stuff, including even the little containers required to ship the little stuff. Think of all those Amazon boxes right now. And all the way up to the lightest manufacturing, such as a computer chip manufacturing, which then you could say grades into a particular service sector that we call information services. And we should talk about this briefly because for some time, and I suppose still in some circles, there's this fuzzy notion that we can somehow dematerialize the economy by going to more and more of this activity relative to these other earlier activities. And the thing that we should recognize with the service of information provision is that how is it going to be how will it be relevant to GDP growth unless it's serving all those other sectors. So if you investigate what these folks are doing, they invariably are having something to do with the other trophic structures that we already looked at, starting at the trophic base of heavy extraction and agriculture. Which brings us to the energy sector, which you, in some ways, we could consider the ultimate base of the economy, because none of those activities really transpire without all this energy. I prefer to consider agriculture the base, because that is the economic activity that ties in most directly with the economy of nature and its base, and the function of photosynthesis. But it certainly is the case that with the heavy industrialized agriculture that we have today, as well as all those other sectors, we have to have all this. And of course, there's this hope out there that there will be more and more of this and less of like the tar sands in Alberta and these massive dams that aren't sustainable in the long run because of sedimentation and so on. But I don't know, maybe we should be careful what we wish for, because how's that starting to look as mountain ranges and valleys fill up with these things? And then also when you consider that the economy grows via the liquidation of that natural capital that had earlier provided habitats or comprised wildlife habitats, well, then having more and more of this stuff is kind of like having a bigger gun to shoot yourself in the foot with. And furthermore, if you're hell bent on GDP growth, like say, like Donald Trump was or has been as president, then you're not even going to settle for that. You're going to want all of this. So it's just the wrong goal for the 21st century, and I think that ought to be maybe one of the biggest messages that scientists warn publics and policymakers with. But yeah, and of course, in the economic production process, they're pursuant to the second law of thermodynamics, is going to be a tailpipe, and all else equal, the stuff coming out of it is greater as the economy grows. Doesn't mean it's going to be greater per capita. It can actually decline per capita, but it continues to increase in the gross as GDP grows. We'll be covering that shortly. But I think we have a pretty good knowledge now that GDP, as that flow of money, can be used itself to indicate the carrying capacity of the economy. And when we go back to that earlier diagram, the ecological macroeconomic vision of growth, well, which was like this, remember, we might want to just replace this circular flow of money with a little more complete vision of the economy, and we would be looking at it then like this, where this trophic structure is growing. See the trophic base expanding across the earth. So more and more natural capital is being liquidated in these activities to feed these and those, and there's more of this. Okay, so about the only response to that that's worth any consideration, and it's the only response there is really out there to that, by those who would claim that no, there's no limit to growth, and no, there's no fundamental conflict between growth and environmental protection or conservation of resources. They would say, well, what about technological progress? So let's think about that. And the way to look at it's kind of like with those origins of money. We need to know how it really happens, how it originates, where it came from. And we know that, of course, we need research and development to progress technologically. And what that means in an economic context, to clarify, is more output per unit input. So it's a greater productive efficiency. And it takes research and development. And oftentimes, like in Washington, D.C. conferences, when it's not COVID-19 pandemic time, there's a lot of talk about, we have to invest in more R&D so we can have more technological progress so we can solve all these problems. Well, the discussion is pretty shallow. It doesn't really consider where that R&D comes from. So let's look at that next. And of course, it takes profits in the private sector and economic surplus in the public sector to fund the R&D. It's only after the factors of production have been paid off, the wages and the interest and the rents and so on, that there's any chance of R&D. And then there's the dividends that go to the shareholders and the corporate parties in Atlanta and so on. You have to get past all of that to have some research and development happen. And most of the public finance, of course, comes from the private sector to begin with in taxes. So this is a questionable thing. It's sort of like it takes the R&D to maintain the profits, but you have to have profits to maintain the R&D. This is kind of a catch-22 that, excuse me, I am not taking too much time to explain here, but if you, read our stuff on this, it's explained pretty thoroughly. Basically, I'll tell you in a nutshell, in conventional and any relevant economics, profits dry up. It's a standard function with the iron law of wages and so on. Profits dry up, except for those firms that are able to maintain some competitive advantage over the others. And the way that happens is, the stock answer for how that happens is, well, they conduct research and development. So that's how you wind up with sort of a catch-22. And what's always missed is what at the very base that sort of disengages that catch-22 and allows for all of this to happen in an ongoing manner, at least until limits to growth are encountered. And it's called economies of scale, which are simply reductions in the average cost of product resulting from increased level of output. But the key point here is that this increased output occurs at existing levels of technology. So yes, there's increased efficiency. It's economies of scale that are not just concurrently, but concomitantly, with an increase in aggregate throughput. That's the key phrase, increase in aggregate throughput. So here's an example of economies of scale. It's the same basic level of technology, internal combustion engine, single draft hull, same, even similar types of containers. Same basic level of 20th, 21st century technology. But of course, this operation is way more efficient in terms of product transported per unit of energy than that is. And I think it's pretty obvious which one is more sustainable. So sustainability is all about the size of the operation ultimately. And with that, I'll just say a few words about optimum scale and we'll wrap it up. So we, toward the beginning, displayed this, recognizing that neither growth nor degrowth are sustainable. That leaves the steady state economy, and I may want to put it this way, like in a tweet or something, but you have to wonder a little bit about this, because I don't know, we're at that 70-some trillion dollar, which by the way was almost up to 89 trillion. If you were very, very observant when the GDP meter was rolling on your screen before, you would have noticed is that we have it rolling backwards right now as a function of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we probably won't readjust it to be running back forward until there's vaccination or a longer period of recession. So is it happy times at this, let's say the current level of GDP is at the optimal level? Well, you know, we consider this at CASI to be the biggest question for democracy in the 21st century. How do we democratically account for the preferences of, say, people like me? You know, I think I would have preferred the world, I did prefer the world with a much lesser GDP. I'm a wildlife biologist originally. You know, I love being out in the wilderness areas and so on. And I find those places disappearing, and I find so much pollution and invasive species and noise and traffic. I don't like this level of GDP. But we do have a lot of other people. First of all, they never got to see it down at these lower levels, so they don't know what they're missing. They only know what they see now. And there are folks that just by their nature would prefer, I suppose, in the entire Europe and North America and planet to be like one giant London or New York City or Beijing. So I say that this is the biggest challenge for democracy in the 21st century, is to figure out how to get to a relatively optimal level, all people and all things considered, nationally and globally. To do that, it helps to have some metrics that sort of progress from just the sheer size of the economy to measures that start to get at the health of things, the Living Planet Index, Human Development Index, this one, Genuine Progress Indicator, until finally you're looking at sort of the bottom line, happiness. So, you know, the economy shouldn't be for its own sake. It should be for the sake of people's well-being and happiness. And so I think I'll just close this out going for full circle when we recognize that, well, maybe there's a little bit too much focus these days on solutions, and so much of an effort to get to solutions sometimes are kind of sloppy solutions like oxymoronic, green growth or sustainable growth. Those aren't solutions at all. When we recognize that the only sustainable alternative is the steady state economy. But I'll just leave the tip of the iceberg in what we can do. First of all, we can do less. And of course, what we mean by that is, you know, buying less, consuming less, building less, driving less, heating less, heating, especially the wasteful ways like the outdoor heating in restaurants, things like that, that can be trimmed off, the fat that can be trimmed off the economy most readily. So it's kind of a sardonic sort of answer to that question, but something to think about. But while you're doing less, we still want you to read more. And there are any number of great books we could pitch here. So I decided just to mention that these are the last two off the Steady State Press. At CASI, we have an imprint called the Steady State Press. And when you join CASI, you can join CASI and we'll send you a copy of Best of the Daily News. These are really great little articles. We consider this kind of a primer on ecological macroeconomics. This one just came off the press literally last week. And it is what it says. It's all about the shortcomings of the human mind in an evolutionary sense, primarily, for handling big picture, long-term challenges like limits to growth and climate change and biodiversity loss. It's uncommon sense. We need to try to help spread it around and replace all that, the banality around, consumer confidence. And otherwise, you could start by signing the CASI position on economic growth at steadystate.org, which really helps to precipitate the paradigm shifts and to pursue the policy reforms. And we'd love to talk with you about the specific examples of that anytime you're ready. And it helps us to advance the steady state economy for environmental protection, economic sustainability, and yes, national security and international stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. That was fantastic. A lot of detail. So brilliant. Thank you very much. If you can unshare. Let's have a look. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, we've had a lot of questions. We've only got about 10 minutes to go. I'm actually going to bring in an issue which has been raised by quite a lot of people, and I think we'll just summarize it because it's come in many different formats from many different people. Population. Currently, as we continue with our population growth, we're putting effectively a new London onto the planet every single month. In the context of putting a new London into the planet every single month, how are we ever going to reach a steady state economics?
Yeah, well, we can't with population growth. Remember, we go back to the very definition of economic growth. It entails increasing population and per capita production and consumption. And so if we want to be serious about us moving toward a steady state economy, that also entails stabilizing population and per capita production and consumption. Our approach at CASI has been that it's very difficult and maybe less feasible to lead with the issue of population stabilization, because right away you run into some really heavy duty religious resistance, theological in some sense, I guess, but religious. And there's a sort of knee-jerk reaction out there among some religious communities against that. It's almost like a taboo topic. Whereas when you talk about per capita consumption and you talk about GDP growth, nothing taboo at all. It's a secular matter that's very much ingrained in public policy and in political dialogue. So we would say it's a better idea to lead with discussions about limits to growth in terms of GDP. And then very soon it kind of plops out of the bag that, yeah, that means population as well as per capita consumption. And I might add that there have been some really helpful developments of late when we think about the current Pope, Pope Francis, who has little by little, I think, sort of taken away that idea that the Catholic Church, you know, a huge influence in these matters, is all about reproduction. He said things like, we don't have to be breeding like rabbits, and he has been strongly arguing for, well, I'll use an example. His second from last, I think, encyclical, which was called the Laudato Si', it's all about limits to growth. It's practically an implicit prescription for a steady state economy.
Yes, and thank you very much. And in fact, Laudato Si' also tells us to get off the sidelines. So he also alludes to the fact, doesn't say it quite in these terms, but if you are not out there fighting to put it right, then you are effectively causing the damage yourself. So you've got to get out and do it, and calls us all to ecological conversion, to actually getting it and getting to understand these topics and moving forward. Going straight to questions from Brian McGavin. Despite a renewed economic crisis with COVID, mainstream politicians and media have persistently ignored the logic of the steady state, ecologically coherent economy. Why do you think this is?
Oh, well, that's very much a matter of political economy and the influence of big money. Big money is almost always very pro-growth money. big money and dark money, if you're familiar with that concept, and that the examples in the USA with the Koch brothers and that expansive network of those who would try to persuade and propagandize us into believing in perpetual GDP growth. I haven't actually read this follow-up book yet. I just thought I have this book now called The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Some of you may remember this fella, John Perkins. He wrote that book a dozen years ago or so, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It was all about how he was paid huge salaries to advance it, to push this notion, especially in developing countries, that GDP growth was the way to solve problems, including environmental problems. So there's that's why the mainstream politicians during this COVID-19 pandemic have said nothing about limits to growth or the need for a steady state economy. Their campaigns, at least in the US, they're financed almost entirely by, I don't want to say almost entirely. I should say that almost the entire population of national level politicians is funded to great extent by big money and by dark money, big dark money.
Great.
Hey, I'll tell you that we have a lot of scholars out there probably. This manifests in academia. It's almost impossible to find a program out there these days in ecological macroeconomics. And that helps to explain it. There's no funding for that. We're very much swimming upstream in the river of political economy when we're advancing the steady state economy and warning folks about climate change and so on. But I do want to make sure I get in a couple of words of encouragement. Despite that constant swimming upstream, we have two really key things on our side. And this is where, scientists warning Europe helps so much, because those two things are sound science and common sense. And those are really powerful things. We bring those to bear to this dialogue. I think we can refute $1 million worth of dark money propaganda with $1 worth of our efforts.
Certainly agree with that. And actually, you were calling to action people at the end of your talk. And just to add in terms of some of the activism on it, is to call people to action politically. And I don't mean writing to your Senate member or your member of parliament. I mean, going out and standing. In the UK, go and join a parish council. Half of them don't have enough people on it. Go and join it and declare a climate emergency. There are county elections next week. Stand. It doesn't matter if you don't get a vote. Stand. Call them to account. Shout out for the climate activism we need to do, and do it on the official process. And do the same in the general election. Stand, even if you're not going to get through, and take the story to them. Lots of questions, so we're going to race through quite a few of them now. Okay, from John Barry. Brian, what do you think of the view that a sustainable society is a world of posts? Post-carbon, post-growth, and post-capitalism. And has followed up, why the resistance to the last post? Why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism?
I think the shortest answer I could give to that about why isn't the post-capitalism part more prominent, at least in the USA, is that we look at growth having been just as much the goal of, for example, the Soviet Union. We got to remember the Cold War was waged in terms of GDP growth. So we're very much on board with the critiques of capitalism, but we also want to warn, I guess, that that's not enough. It's the goal of GDP growth that's the real biggest enemy. Can't hear anything.
The microphone's turned off again, Ed.
Right, my apologies. I'm still on mute, getting late in the day. In Canada, we're advocating for a basic income guarantee as a cornerstone of a just recovery from the pandemic and as a means of helping Canadians transition to a sustainable economy. We believe addressing income insecurity by ensuring no one falls into poverty is key to helping our systems through the social and ecological transition ahead. Do you consider a basic income guarantee that eliminates poverty and provides income security for those who need it a means of addressing inequality and supporting a degrowth economy?
The short answer is yes, we do support that. We had one of our blog articles this past year by one of our Cassie fellows, James Johnston, provided a good argument for that, and we concur with it. We're in the process of developing legislation for macroeconomic policy reform in the US. We're calling it the Full and Sustainable Employment Act. These would be major amendments to the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978, which is like the central economic policy of the USA. And the minimum income, basic income, will be a part of that.
That actually adds to a question earlier on, actually from Brian McGavin, which I hadn't come to, but do you see part of our reconstruction after COVID as encouraging people to go into job shares in order to reduce the economy?
That certainly would be congruent with understanding, a recognition of limits to growth, and the need for sharing in general, including, the sharing for employment opportunities. I was part of a webinar series a couple of months ago, and I wish I could remember the fellow's name, but his talk was all about the sharing economy. It was really good stuff, impressive, more advanced than I thought it would be, and a lot of examples out there already.
Now, just to say, Brian, we're now running over time. Are you happy to continue for another 15 minutes or so if people are staying? Right, great.
Absolutely.
That'd be brilliant. Thank you very much. A question from Esther. I'm very short. Can we stabilize at the use of 1.7 planets?
Well, was it can we stabilize or can
we even? I think the idea she's probably pushing at is, are we even going to stop when we know we're already consuming so much of the planet, or are we just going to continue until it's 2, 3, 4, 5?
That's a great question, and that kind of redounds to the issue of whether to be pushing for a steady state economy or explicitly emphasizing degrowth. We know there's a fairly developed degrowth movement in Europe, relatively speaking. It's much more developed than the steady state economics movement is in the North America. Our approach at Cassie is we say a couple things. One is one paradigm shift at a time. We think that one potential scenario is moving off the growth path to a steady state economy for some time, and then period of degrowth, and then a lower, more optimal steady state economy. We've also started adopting and using the phrase degrowth toward a steady state economy. So, and the COVID-19 pandemic has, I hate to use the word helped because it sounds so awful, but it has resulted in a significant phase of degrowth already. And so if we could just tap into that and help enough of our citizenry to understand that it would be a wasted scenario, a wasted crisis, if we just went right back to business as usual and bloated that economy up to 90 trillion again.
Got a question from Bill Dowling. A steady state economy must mean an optimum level of population where each human is consuming at an optimum level of consumption, which must mean far greater equality of consumption all over the world. Is this correct? But just before you answer it, another speaker on another day alluded to the fact that if we were going to consume over the world equally, that would mean everybody in the West, in America and the UK, going down to consuming at the level of a gross income of $5,000 a month.
Right. So we have to, of course, progress in a way that's politically possible. And that's why I say, you know, one paradigm shift at a time. We bring wealth equality, but that, you know, wealth equality doesn't mean everybody has the exact same amount either. We have to start with what's politically possible, and we can have, I think we can find plenty of political support at the far margins, you know, the crazy margins of wealth and income. And so going back to that legislation that we're developing, we include in there what we call the 15 times sectoral salary cap, where within any given sector, no one's salary can be more than 15 times greater than the least salary in performing that sector, which in most sectors would be a minimum wage. And so we feel that 15 times may just be kind of a political possibility sweet spot for now.
Okay. Do organizations like CASI that advocate for a steady state circular economy, such as the group led by Tim Jackson in the UK, who was lead author of the report in 2009, Prosperity Without Growth, do they need to work collectively to reach mainstream politics?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, the more allies you can get with a unified policy push, the better, the more likely you will be to be successful. I think one of the problems we face in degrowth and steady state and well-being and prosperity without growth and circular kind of circles, so to speak, is that there are so few of us because of that river of political economy that's not sending the money to us, but against us, that we're all so busy. You know, our plates are relatively even more full, I'm afraid, than the typical scholar or activist out there. And so we don't get nearly as much opportunity as we would wish to collaborate and build these. I think we all know that we're allies, you know, like Tim Jackson, he's a CASI signatory. We're fans of Tim Jackson. I remember inviting him to give a talk at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters 12, 15 years ago. But then I was gagged by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from talking about the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. So it's sometimes it's hard to collaborate even for civil servants.
Okay, a question now from Richard Watson. I'm studying for a PhD at Leeds University. My research is focusing on MMT, endogenous money, and its implications for the steady state economy. Do you think MMT has a valid place in that field?
You know, we're looking at that because we do abide by, we operate pursuant to the Trophic theory of money. And so I feel from what I've learned about MMT, modern monetary theory, it's not very well developed yet enough in terms of what it has to say about limits to money supplies and flows like GDP. I think if it ever adopts, if it can be coupled with the Trophic theory of money, then yeah, it would. It has some utility in public policy.
Okay. Question from Chris. This is great work that would help to develop more awareness about sustained economic growth in developing nations like Nigeria, where acute poverty reigns supreme. My question borders on how to meet the challenges of food insecure problems in the face of teeming population growth, as well as looming global economic crisis occasioned by COVID-19.
Well, there's no silver bullet. lot of damage has already been done by overpopulation, by overdevelopment, by COVID-19, by limits to growth. You know, limits to growth, we often think of it as something off in the future yet when we're surrounded by it. We have limits to growth manifesting in so many different ways. And all we can do in the scenario that was just specified is our best to mitigate and to improve and to assist. The thing that we see changing as there's a paradigm shift away from growth to a steady state economy, or degrowth toward a steady state economy, is what we like to call steady statesmanship in international diplomacy. So instead of the USA as, I guess, the prime example of race and China now too, a very, very heavy duty example of moving around the world and taking that natural capital and giving little in return and keeping nations mired in poverty. And, you know, the USA, especially with the heavy per capita consumption, should, as part of that transition to a steady state economy, assist, literally, with just financially, materially, technologically assist those countries that are really truly mired in poverty, starting with the lowest per capita consumption levels. And not only is it the right thing to do, but frankly, it's also the smart thing to do in terms of national security and international stability. So that's our basic answer to that. And if we can ever get to an administration where we're at the table to help strategize and devise international diplomacy and macroeconomic policy, that's what will happen.
Great. I would just add on to something to Chris, and maybe actually a bit of information for you, Brian. We had a speaker actually on our food day from Nigeria, Dr. Mahmoud, who's actually an author of The World Scientist's Second Warning to Humanity. And he wasn't presenting the silver bullet to Nigeria's problems or to anybody else's, but he was presenting the fact that with satellite mapping, actually there is a lot that can be done to inform better agricultural practices, the planting of the right crops in the right areas where they can be grown, planting of particular trees, etc., that will avoid environmental problems. And he suggested that actually in the short term in Nigeria, satellite mapping could actually solve the food crisis in the short term, not in the long term if the climate crisis keeps running away from itself. But anyway, and that talk will be available online for everybody to see later on. Question now from Gwen. So far, the Cassie petition is being signed by lots of private people. Are there plans how to make countries' governments sign the petition and implement sustainable growth policies on a governmental level?
All the time we're working toward that, looking for that. We came this close to having at least one head of state sign it. I guess I can say that was the Prime Minister of Bhutan, shortly after he had converted the Kingdom of Bhutan to the ministerial government. Also, Ban Ki-moon was, an inch away from signing until his handlers got him moving again. So, we've had very close calls with high-level diplomats and statesmen and statespeople and so on. But we have a long way to go. A lot of swimming up that river of political economy. Well, I'll add one more example. I'm not going to identify the country just yet because I don't know if I should take that liberty. But there is a country in Africa that is considering saying to the rest of the world, to the USA and China and so on, we've had enough of this. We're not into this notion of GDP growth, economic growth. We want our people to be happy, protected, stable ecosystem, stable ecosystem, stable agriculture, And so we're no longer going to cooperate and be part of these growth institutions. We're transitioning to a steady state economy, and maybe and in our case, in our African country, we probably need a little bit of growth yet to have a reasonable, a chance at a successful steady state economy. But that would be huge. Can you imagine the precedent that would set? It would almost shame the wealthy countries around the world that this would be starting from a spot where there's a lot of true poverty yet, in those material terms, especially, and they would be setting the precedent for steady statesmanship.
That would be great to see. So we'll look forward to hearing about that one. I'm going to take one more question now from our list of questions from the attendees. Hans-Peter Plug, and this is putting you on the spot on meat in the same way as we did on population at the beginning. So humans and their livestock make up in mass roughly 90% of all animals with 2 kilograms or more weight, with this percentage rapidly increasing. How can someone think that this could ever work out, no matter how steady the economy is?
Right. Well, I agree. And I think that does go back to the issue of most likely, very likely, needing degrowth to a steady state economy. It's so tricky to get these points out to the general public as well, because if we say, well, we're using 1.7 Earths now, and overshoot day was August 22, and these then the question is, well, how come we're still here then? We still see that economy functioning. So we have to deal with those nuances of temporary states of affairs. And so that's that's something also that favors the strategy of moving not immediately to the degrowth phase intentionally, but moving from the goal of growth to the goal of a steady state economy. And then in reality, recognize that we've had some degrowth already because of COVID-19, and trying to move to the steady state from there.
Right. I'd just like to pose an additional question to you myself as we finish now. And thinking about where we are in the UK, we've got COP26 in a year's time. So with the context of COP26 coming, in the context that we will have a Conservative government almost certainly for the next 10 years, and because of that, very likely the same Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. If we were to start pressing some buttons here in this year towards COP26, taking action to make sure the right things happened in the context of our political environment, what would you recommend we do?
Well, I think that there have to be very explicit goals that are presented to the political system there that would be moving their way up to Boris Johnson and other higher level politicians that aren't too complicated. That's one of the reasons we like to deal largely in ecological macroeconomics at CASI, without getting in the weeds of all these different microeconomic scenarios, the valuation of natural capital and ecosystem services, and how to tweak this market here and adjust that tax. We feel that it's crucial to get the right goal set, and if we can get the African example to as a starting point. There are some limited examples already, like the very popular Prime Minister of New Zealand, Ardern, announcing that their budget was not geared now toward GDP growth, but rather toward well-being of the citizens. We feel at CASI that every time there's another relatively prominent political move made toward the steady state economy or in steady statesmanship, it's having more than just that additive effect. We're at the stage where there are synergistic effects among these different efforts. And I'm sorry, that's not a very specific answer about what to do in the UK right now. I just don't have that much knowledge of that.
No, I appreciate that. And I think one thing that comes out of it, which is so important, is actually focus. And effectively, you're saying, get the demands right, make it simple for the politicians to focus. Don't worry about the detail. As an example, if they focus on a 2025 net zero target, the detail will come out of that focus. So don't get caught up in the detail, which is very sound advice. So thank you so much, Brian. We've run over by 20 minutes on this, so thank you very, very much for that. Before we finish, just like to talk about what's happening tomorrow. First talk tomorrow, Insect Apocalypse, is sold out, but we have 2 other talks, and then we have a